I moved out to the country for one reason: peace. After years of choking traffic, nosy neighbours, and the unspoken competition of who had the greener lawn, I'd had enough. I bought myself a sprawling ranch just outside the city limits, nestled on the edge of the woods with enough acres to stretch out and breathe. My nearest neighbour was technically half a mile away, which suited me just fine. The property had an old red barn, a modest house with a wraparound porch, and a handful of chickens that wandered the yard like little feathery sheriffs. For the first few months, life was everything I had hoped it would be. Quiet mornings, starry nights, and a silence so thick it felt like a blanket. That was until Karen showed up. She came marching up my gravel driveway one Saturday morning like she owned the place. Clipboard in hand, pastel cardigan wrapped tightly over her pressed khakis, and an expression carved from stone, she didn't bother with a greeting. She simply announced that she was the president of the Homeowners Association from the gated community that bordered the far edge of my land. I didn't know the two properties touched until she told me. I also didn't know I was about to enter a months-long war over boundaries, both literal and personal. Karen informed me, in no uncertain terms, that my chickens were visually disruptive, that my barn's faded paint was lowering the neighborhood value, and that my ranch-style fencing didn't meet their aesthetic guidelines. I blinked, confused, and calmly explained that my property wasn't part of the HOA. She paused just for a moment before tightening her jaw and declaring that I was still part of the community environment and should behave accordingly. That was the beginning. From that day forward, Karen became a fixture. She'd show up uninvited, wandering around the edge of my property, scribbling notes and muttering about violations. She treated my land like it was her domain, and no matter how many times I reminded her she had no authority here, she kept coming back. At first I laughed it off, but the more she intruded, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just annoying, she was dangerous in the way only a petty tyrant with too much time can be. It wasn't long after her first uninvited appearance that Karen decided to escalate things. One morning, as I was enjoying a cup of coffee on the porch while watching the chickens peck at the grass, I spotted her again, marching down the gravel like a bureaucratic soldier. This time, she had a stack of papers tucked beneath her arm and a grim look of purpose that made my stomach churn. She didn't bother with small talk. She stopped at the base of the steps, cleared her throat with the sharpness of a gavel, and held up a stapled packet like it was a subpoena. "I've compiled a list," she said, as if I'd asked for it. "These are items that need to be addressed immediately if you're going to continue residing next to our community." I leaned forward in my chair, half amused, half baffled. "A list?" She nodded, lips pursed. "First, the barn needs repainting. That chipped red paint is an eyesore visible from our walking path. Second, the grass along your fence line is overgrown and unruly, particularly that wild native grass. It's not just unsightly, it's a fire hazard. Third, the chickens must be kept in an enclosure at all times. Free-roaming animals present a biohazard, not to mention the smell." I stared at her, blinking slowly, waiting for the punchline. But she didn't flinch. She stood there, fully convinced of her right to dictate how I ran my own land. When I reminded her, again, that I wasn't part of her HOA, she waved me off with a sigh, like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "Technically, no," she admitted. "But your proximity to our community still means your choices impact our environment. We have standards, and frankly, your disregard for them is causing discomfort to the residents on the east side." I tried to stay calm, I really did. But something about the way she said, "your choices," like they were offensive in themselves, lit a fuse in me. I folded my arms, looked her square in the eye and said, "Karen, this is my land. My name's on the deed. I don't answer to your HOA, and I sure as hell don't answer to you." She stiffened, eyes narrowing, and clutched her clipboard like it was a badge. "I'll be speaking to the board. We'll see what steps can be taken." Then she turned and walked away, back straight, heels crunching across the gravel with the finality of a judge leaving the bench. I watched her disappear through the side path that ran between her development and the edge of my woods, knowing deep down that this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up after being told no. In fact, that word probably fueled her like gasoline on a fire. I crumpled the packet she'd left behind and tossed it in the trash. I'd underestimated her resolve, but I wouldn't make that mistake again. After our last encounter, I hoped Karen might finally get the message. For a brief moment, there was silence. No visits, no unsolicited paperwork, no condescending remarks about community standards. But that calm didn't last. Within a week, I noticed something new near the tree line that bordered her neighborhood. A tall pole with a mounted security camera, angled just enough to catch a good view of my backyard. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe she was just upgrading her home security. But that theory died when I caught the red light blinking, recording, every time I walked outside. She was watching me, not just observing, but actively surveilling my property like some sort of HOA spy. I waved at the camera once, sarcastically, and flipped it off the next time. No response. Just that unblinking lens, silently judging my every move. The sense of being watched sank into my bones. I started checking my windows more, locking the chicken coop at night, and keeping the porch lights on. The peace I'd worked so hard to find was now peppered with tension and paranoia. Then came the real trouble. One morning I went out to collect eggs and found the coop door wide open. Not just unlatched, open. A few eggs were missing and the hens were visibly shaken, feathers ruffled and clucking nervously. I knew I hadn't forgotten to close it. I always double-checked. At first I blamed raccoons. Then, a few days later, I found my scarecrow lying face down in the field, with its head torn off and a smiley face drawn in marker on the hay-stuffed shirt. That's when I knew it wasn't animals. Someone was messing with me. I reviewed my own security footage, something I had reluctantly installed after Karen's second visit, and sure enough, there she was. Just after midnight, flashlight in hand, creeping along the fence line and leaning over to poke around. She never stepped too far in, just enough to peer in windows and inspect what she called violations. The footage was clear, her hair in that tight bun, that familiar cardigan pulled tight despite the warm night, and that unmistakable look of righteous indignation even in the dim glow of her flashlight. I confronted her the next day, walking straight to her house, USB drive in hand. She answered the door with a smile so fake it almost hurt to look at. "You're trespassing now," she said before I could even speak. I held up the drive. "You were on my property last night. I've got it on video." Her smile didn't budge. "Community inspection. I had a right to ensure nothing hazardous was taking place." "You don't have a right to anything on my land," I growled, but she just shrugged and closed the door in my face. That night, I sat on my porch watching the red light of her camera blink from the trees and made a decision. If she wanted to play games, I was going to change the rules entirely. I never planned on stepping foot into one of those HOA meetings, but Karen left me no choice. After the scarecrow incident, the nighttime prowling, and her latest stunt, sending a cease and desist letter claiming I was polluting the neighborhood aesthetic, I decided it was time to confront the circus on its home turf. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of her gated community, a place with more polished granite and floral arrangements than I thought possible for a room meant to discuss trash pickup and fence heights. I wore my dusty boots and flannel on purpose. Let them see the man they were trying to regulate. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the long table like a queen before her court. The other members sat stiffly, a mix of bored retirees and overeager volunteers who clearly had nothing better to do on a Tuesday evening. I was the only outsider in the room, and the way Karen looked at me when I walked in, you'd think I'd tracked mud across a cathedral. Before I could say anything, she cleared her throat and launched into a tirade. She spoke about unauthorized structures, livestock disruptions, and behavior unbecoming of a neighboring resident. She used big, official-sounding words, and for a moment I could tell she thought she had them eating out of her hand. Then I stepped forward and asked for the floor. There was hesitation, but one of the board members nodded. I pulled a small projector from my bag, set it up on the table, and without saying a word, played the footage. Karen creeping around my fence line, Karen unlatching the chicken coop, Karen yanking the scarecrow down. There were gasps. A few people shifted in their seats, embarrassed, while Karen's expression froze. She didn't say a word, didn't even blink. When the video ended, I looked straight at her and said, "You want to talk about disruptions? This is trespassing." She finally spoke, but her voice was thin now, brittle. It was necessary. I was protecting the community. "You were harassing a private citizen," I replied. "And next time I won't just bring video, I'll bring the sheriff." The room went silent. Karen stood up and left without another word. No apology, no explanation, just the sound of her heels echoing down the marble hallway. I knew then this wasn't finished, but I also knew she'd underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect my peace. After that meeting, things got quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brings relief. It was the kind that makes your skin itch, like you're waiting for the next blow to land. Karen hadn't shown up since the HOA disaster, but I knew better than to think she'd given up. People like her didn't go away. They regrouped, they recalculated, and then they came back twice as loud. I started double-checking my gates, locking up early and sleeping with one ear open. Peace, the very reason I moved out here, felt like it was slipping further and further away. One night, sitting on the porch with a cold drink and a mind too tired for sleep, I was flipping through channels when a documentary caught my eye. It was about medieval fortresses, moats, and ancient defenses used to keep invaders out. I laughed at first, imagining armored knights and fire-lit drawbridges, but the longer I watched, the more the idea burrowed into my brain. A moat. A physical, undeniable line. One that couldn't be ignored, stepped over, or twisted by a clipboard and a smug smile. It started as a joke, just a passing thought. But by morning, it had grown into something serious. I pulled up zoning laws, property rights, water flow regulations. To my delight, everything I needed to make it happen was within legal bounds. No HOA rules, no permits required, just good old-fashioned dirt, sweat, and a little creativity. If Karen didn't respect boundaries, I'd build one she couldn't ignore, not a wall she could climb over, not a fence she could cut through, a trench, a moat. Something so absurd and so undeniably effective that even she would have to back down. That night, I fell asleep for the first time in weeks, with a smile on my face. The morning I began digging the moat, the sun hadn't even crested over the treetops. I stood at the edge of my property with a rented backhoe and a thermos full of coffee, feeling more like a medieval warlord than a rancher. The grass was still wet with dew, and the air smelled of earth and opportunity. I'd marked out the perimeter with little orange flags the night before, outlining a wide oval around the front half of the property, leaving the backside untouched where the forest met the hills. That area was naturally protected. It was the side near Karen's subdivision that needed fortification. As the first scoop of soil lifted and fell, it was like I was unburdening myself. Every pass of the shovel was a middle finger to months of stress, surveillance, and condescension. The work was loud, messy, and therapeutic. I had a few curious looks from drivers on the nearby road, but out here, people mind their own business. At least, most people. By noon, I'd cleared enough to make it obvious something unusual was happening. Karen didn't show up right away, but her presence made itself known in the form of two men in polo shirts who strolled over from the HOA entrance, hands in pockets and fake smiles plastered across their faces. They asked what I was building. I told them the truth. A moat. They laughed, but I didn't. One of them blinked and said, "You're serious?" I nodded. "It's for privacy," I said. Not that anyone would understand the concept around here. They left without much more to say, but I could tell they'd report back. And right on schedule, 2 hours later, Karen arrived. She didn't approach at first. She stood at the edge of the boundary line, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Eventually, when the engine noise died down and I stepped away for water, she marched right up to the flags and pointed accusingly at the trench. "This is not acceptable. It's dangerous. It's unsightly. You can't just dig a ditch in plain view of our community walking path." I sipped from my bottle, then looked at her over the rim. "It's not a ditch. It's a moat. This is a neighborhood, not a castle. Then maybe your kingdom should stay on its side of the border." She sputtered, trying to gather herself, but I turned back to the machine and restarted the engine before she could come up with a retort. Her voice became lost in the mechanical growl. By the end of the third day, the moat was dug, 10 feet wide and about 4 feet deep. I lined it with black pond liner and began filling it with water from my own well system, a process that would take time but was well within my means. I even installed solar-powered underwater lights for a dramatic nighttime glow and set up tiki torches around the perimeter. because if I was going to be petty, I was going to be theatrical about it. For the final touch, I placed 2 inflatable alligator floats in the water. They were cartoonish and clearly fake, but from a distance, they added just the right amount of menace. I even hung a handmade wooden sign that read, "Private property, cross at your own risk." When the moat was finished, I stood at the edge, sweaty, sore, and more satisfied than I'd felt in months. My property looked ridiculous, and it was perfect. Karen wanted to invade my space, wanted to control what wasn't hers. Now, if she wanted in, she'd have to wade through water, face my floats, and confront her own reflection in every ripple. Peace, I realized, isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's a moat lit by torches and guarded by inflatable reptiles. For a few glorious days, it was silent. No HOA emails, no clipboard visits, no sideways glares from the walking path. The moat had done its job, its ridiculous, muddy, over-the-top job. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee in the mornings, watching the sun glint off the water, listening to the hens cluck softly and marvel at the serenity. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last. People like Karen didn't disappear quietly. She was the kind of storm that always came back for one last downpour. It happened late in the afternoon, just as the sky was beginning to soften into that golden hour light. I was inside, fixing a loose hinge on a cabinet, when I heard a splash, followed by an angry shriek. Rushing outside, I saw the familiar pastel of Karen's cardigan flailing in the moat, water up to her chest, her hair soaked and dragging across her face like seaweed. Floating beside her was one of the inflatable alligators, slowly turning in circles, as if enjoying the chaos. Karen had apparently tried to cross the moat using a plank of wood, which now floated several feet away, bobbing gently in her watery defeat. She must have thought she could sneak over, maybe to make a final point or prove she wasn't intimidated. But her plan had ended the way all of her schemes did, messy, dramatic, and soaked in entitlement. "What are you doing?" I called out, not bothering to hide my laughter. "This is trespassing," she yelled, thrashing to get to the edge. I took out my phone and started recording. "You're the one swimming in my yard." "You'll hear from my attorney." "I'll send them the footage," I replied. "Might want to dry off first." By the time she dragged herself out, dripping and red with fury, I'd already emailed the video to myself and saved it twice. She stomped off without another word, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across the grass. That was the last time Karen set foot on my property. She never filed charges, maybe because she knew how foolish she looked. Or maybe, finally, she realized she'd been beaten by something she couldn't control. A moat, a man with a shovel, and the power of simply being left alone. After Karen's soggy retreat from the moat, something shifted. For the first time in months, the edge of my property stayed quiet. No more footsteps crunching gravel uninvited. No more unsolicited letters about aesthetic cohesion. No more stares from across the fence line like I was some outlaw living outside civilization. She didn't return. Not to apologize, not to argue, not even to glare. It was as if the moat had done more than just separate our land. It had severed whatever twisted sense of control she believed she had. A few days later, I noticed her security camera had been taken down. A week after that, the HOA sent a general notice about recommitting to respectful boundaries and announced that Karen would be taking an extended leave from her duties as president. Word around the neighborhood was that even some of her loyal supporters had grown tired of her crusades. It was as if the spell had broken, and everyone realized that policing paint colors and poultry wasn't worth the drama. I reclaimed my routine. Mornings on the porch with coffee, afternoons tending to the chickens, evenings watching the sunset bounce off the moat's surface like ripples of freedom. The inflatable gators stayed in place, not out of necessity anymore, but as a symbol. A reminder that sometimes peace doesn't come from compromise or conversation. Sometimes it comes from digging deep, standing firm, and making sure the line you draw can't be crossed without consequence. Neighbors started waving again. One even asked if I'd consider helping him build a moat of his own. I just smiled and told him it takes more than a ditch. It takes commitment, the kind born from battle. And now that mine was over, the silence felt hard-won, deserved, and absolutely beautiful. Months passed, and life on the ranch settled into something close to perfect. The moat, once a symbol of defiance, had become part of the landscape, oddly charming, even beautiful in its own way. Water lilies floated along the surface now, and birds came to perch at its edge in the early mornings. The tiki torches still stood, though I rarely lit them anymore. The gator floats had faded under the sun, but remained, sentinels of a petty victory that had grown into a private joke between me and the land. Karen moved out, quietly, without fanfare. One day, a for sale sign appeared in her yard, and within a few weeks, a moving truck rolled in. No goodbyes, no final words. Just like that, she vanished. The house sat empty for a time until a young couple moved in, a schoolteacher and an artist who introduced themselves with a pie and warm smiles. They brought no clipboards, no complaints, only curiosity about the infamous moat next door. We got along just fine. The peace I had longed for had returned, but this time it was deeper, earned. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had stood my ground without backing down, without turning bitter. The moat wasn't just a trench of water, it was a boundary that worked when words had failed, a punchline to a story that could have been so much worse. Sometimes at night, I sit by the water, watching it ripple under the moonlight, and smile, not because I won, but because I'm finally left alone. And if the day ever comes when someone else forgets where my land ends and their business begins, well, there's always room to dig a little deeper. Peace is worth it. And now, so is the moat.